Hello all, this is Laura Cole from Hitchin Girls School, and I am going to be doing some training with you here. So let me just present my screen so you can see it. So apologies about the slightly blurry nature of the picture. My laptop's quite old. So as I said, I'm Laura Cole at Hitchin Girls School, and I am mental health lead there, and also head of philosophy and ethics and learning for life. And as of September, I will be Senko. And one of the things I have been really passionate about over the last few years is the importance of staff learning about mental health, because mental health for both young people and ourselves is a potential barrier to learning properly. So that's what this training is all about. So I'm going to go through it, and if you have any questions, I will put my email address at the end of this presentation. You will get this presentation to go along with this video recording, so you should be able to stop and watch it and check out the links that I will point out to you as we go through as well. So a little bit of a true or false first of all. 1 in 10 people will experience psychological difficulties at some point in their lives. Interestingly, this one is actually false, but the reason for it is because it's about 1 in 4 people will experience it at some point in their lives. There's a direct link between self-harm and suicide. That one is in fact false. There have often been kind of miscommunications in the media about the fact that if somebody is feeling like they want to self-harm, that actually that is a call that they want to die. But often self-harm behaviour is linked to something very different to suicidal behaviour, and it's a way of expressing how you're feeling, not necessarily expressing that you want to die. 10% of people under the age of 16 have a clinically diagnosable mental health problem, and that's absolutely true. Doesn't mean that they have all been diagnosed, doesn't mean that they've all been under any treatment for anything, but potentially lots and lots of young people are struggling, which means that lots of people within our classrooms are likely to be finding things challenging too. 50% of mental illness predates higher education, so before you go to university. That one is false, but only because it's higher. It's actually 75% predates higher education. So 3/4 of people who are going to get a mental health problem in the future are likely to have been struggling with it whilst they've been at school with us. And 70% of school children with a diagnosable mental health disorder did not receive treatment at the appropriate time. That one is absolutely true. Unfortunately, CAMHS is an incredibly oversubscribed service, is very, very busy. CAMHS is the Children and Adolescent Mental Health Service, and they only have a certain number of slots available, and therefore lots of young people will be referred back to schools for support first. And in the latest CAMHS review, schools are the first line of defence. We are tier 1 of CAMHS, which means that if we haven't done something to support young people, then they will not be seen by a doctor or CAMHS clinician. In the past 15 years, Hertfordshire A&E admissions for self-harm have increased by 400%. That one is absolutely true too. Now, in terms of that one, interestingly, up until about 2.5 years ago, they didn't really record self-harm admissions very accurately at all. So it could potentially be even higher than that. Recording of self-harm behaviour had been very, very sketchy until Hertfordshire had developed a new policy and a new recording strategy relatively recently. So it'll be interesting to see how the data has changed after that. Now, if you look at this graph, it shows the difference between adult mental health service funding and child and adolescent mental health service funding. So there is a huge gap, and the key problem I can see with this is the fact that actually if 75% of mental health problems are going to develop under the age of 18, yet significantly more of the funding is pumped into over the age of 18, there seems to be a real gap in thinking there. And that's why often we're seeing far more things going on in the classroom, because actually if there was more funding at the grassroots with child and adolescents, we would see adults who are struggling a lot less. But it's not been fixed yet. There are some changes to that funding formula, but this is the latest data I could actually get hold of at this stage. So what I want you to think about is what might be your biggest fears, worries, or questions when exploring mental health or working with young people with poor mental health. And I know one of the biggest fears that lots of people have is this one. They worry that if you talk about it, that it's going to encourage people to struggle more. There is no evidence to suggest this is the case. And actually, lots and lots of evidence, and very well-reasoned evidence through the Anna Freud Centre and through various other organisations, through CAMS, Mind, all sorts of charities, that say talking is the best way to manage and improve the mental health of the nation. When I was at school, we didn't talk about mental health at all. It was something that we didn't understand. It was very different to physical health. It wasn't in the curriculum to learn about it. Whereas these days, it's actually been recognised that learning about well-being and mental health is a really, really essential part of making sure that young people grow up to be the best adult they can be, which is why it's become a statutory part of the RSHE curriculum. But it's also why actually it's really good for all of us as teachers to understand what's going on in relation to mental health. So in terms of that, it's quite important then to understand the brain a little bit and what's going on with the brain. And I would thoroughly recommend having a look at the My Teen Brain resources, which are freely available online. Because they give you a fascinating insight into what is happening in the brain. And it's not just the teenage brain, it's starting from far, far younger. So what we need to know about the teenage brain in particular, though, is that the teenage brain is run primarily by the amygdala. This is the part of the brain which is in control of emotion and memory, and it's what controls your gut reactions. As an adult, we use our prefrontal cortex far more than we use our amygdala. The prefrontal cortex is designed for reasoning, and it's used far more extensively in the adult brain. Now, unfortunately, teenagers, or fortunately, how you want to think about it, teenagers don't use their prefrontal cortex anywhere near as well as an adult. And that's understandable. They're learning how to explore the world and how to develop into their own individualistic kind of emotions and reactions. And the brain is changing hugely from the point of being a newborn to being an adult. So when you're a newborn, we have synapses, but there's very few connections between them. We very, very rapidly start to form those connections, though. And by the age of kind of 2, when you hit the toddler stage, you've got lots and lots of connections. You can do an awful lot more than you could as a newborn. However, when you become an adult, you don't actually need all of those connections anymore. So between being a teenager, from about the age of 11 onwards, you end up with a pruning process going on. And this pruning process strengthens the branches that are left behind, but it also kind of gets rid of the connections in the brain that you don't need anymore. Now, this is a very useful process because just like when you prune a tree, it will grow back stronger, but it also can be quite a confusing process for the brain. So you can have a read of this on the slides, but it's talking about the fact that actually this pruning makes your branches thicker and stronger. It also makes it really easy for the teenage brain to learn. It is designed for learning. It's more like a sponge. And the more you use it and you work that muscle, the better it will become. It's much harder as an adult to learn facts and information than it is as a teenager. Now, I would thoroughly recommend watching Andrew Curran's video. He is an eminent scientist and neurologist in terms of understanding the teenage brain. And if you click on the Vimeo link, it will explain to you what's going on in the brain in terms of chemicals, because it's not just the pruning that's going on and the use of the amygdala and prefrontal cortex. It's also about the chemicals, serotonin and dopamine, and the fact that these aren't in line in the teenage brain causes a lot of the behaviors that we see in young people. Now, the impact of these changes, the pruning and the misalignment of serotonin and dopamine, causes some interesting things to occur. The first thing is that teenagers are far more likely to display risky behavior. They're also, if any of you remember Kevin the teenager, they're far more likely to have extreme emotions as well. And they're far more likely to experiment with drugs and alcohol. All of these things can make it really challenging with having young people in the classroom. Now, an unusual impact of the brain changing is something that happens to their ability to read emotions. So if you have a look at this picture, I want you to think about what emotion would you see on this woman's face? Now, most of the time when I've run this training, people say shock, surprise, maybe fear. Teenagers see something very different. What teenagers see is anger. Because one of the strange things that happens when a teenager's brain is going through the kind of pruning process is that for a short period of time, they lose the ability to actually read facial expressions, which can be quite a challenging thing when you're trying to teach them. So, for example, when you've got year 9 and you're trying to be very, very reasonable and you're explaining instructions, but actually all they're reading on your face is that you're angry with them, it's going to make it challenging to develop that relationship. One really simple trick to try and overcome that is, if you find that a young person is responding with anger, if you talk to them side by side instead of face to face, they aren't threatened by you anymore, because the face that they see is they don't see your face, and therefore they hear your voice rather than seeing the facial expressions, and it's a lot less scary. And that's something we found telling parents has been very helpful. So parents, if they've got to have conversations with their young person, if you go for a walk or if you have that conversation in a car, then you are a lot less threatening to them. So in terms of us as teachers and what we need to do to help young people feel positive about their mental health, it's important that they feel understood. They need to have high self-esteem, so high self-worth, and that will give them more confidence, and then they will feel more positively about their mental health. Now, in terms of this, fight or flight is a natural human instinct, and we need this to keep us safe. It was with us at the time where we were cavemen and we had to decide whether or not we were going to have to run away from the saber-toothed tiger or fight it. And it still exists in us today. And it's one of those things that actually has a real impact on young people's mental health, because it will have a physical effect on how they're feeling. So you might have had young people in your classroom who have said, I really need the toilet, if you tell them that they've got a test, or I feel really sick, I feel really unwell, or you see them shaking, or they go bright red. Now, these are all physical reactions created by the fight or flight response, the kind of fear response when cortisol and adrenaline are released. And if it's anything like me, I have had experiences where I get very nervous. When I first started teaching, I was okay with young people, but other teachers I found the most terrifying people on the planet, because they were really good at their job. They knew what they were doing. They could be really confident. And so having to talk to other teachers, particularly in staff briefing, for example, I would be physically shaking. I would feel unwell, and I would go bright red, literally bright red like a tomato. And that is a really natural thing when you're feeling nervous. There was actually nothing to be threatened by, but my body didn't know that. And that's just the same with teenagers. Now, if you click on this link when you get the slides through, it will show you a video from a series called Let's Talk, which is a series of 5 videos designed for young people to help them understand emotions, well-being, and different mental health conditions. And they can be used as part of the RSHE or the PSHE program. And if there's something that you would like to get hold of, please do drop me an email. I will make sure that I pop my email address on the slides. But this will illustrate to you exactly what anxiety might feel like. And actually, we can all be part of the solution. There are some really simple techniques that you could try with your students in order to help them feel better. And sometimes it's actually just about listening and showing that you care, and that can have a really, really positive impact on the young people that we're working with. So if you find somebody who's having a panic attack or suffering from anxiety, stress, or anger, there's some different things you can try. Now, some schools are not such big fans of this, but we have a lot of young people who will respond very positively to having a stress or a fiddle toy. So it might well be worth considering whether your school will allow those in the classroom. Sometimes we've got students at my school where doodle pads are a really helpful way to help them focus. Now, it can seem incredibly rude when they're drawing rather than seemingly listening to you, but actually there are certain students who will only focus if their brain is focused on something else. So if they're drawing at the same time as listening, because otherwise their brain is just too active and it can't process what's going on in the classroom. Now, 5-9 breathing is where you try and breathe in for a shorter time than you breathe out. So you're breathing in for, and then breathing out. Now, it can work quite well, the 5-9 breathing, particularly if you are counting with them. I've had students where I've actually had to shout the numbers to get them focused, but it doesn't work for all of them. And another one that works is the candle blowing. So you basically take your finger and you imagine that there's a flame on the end. So I'm going to blow it, but not blow it out. And if you practice that yourself, what you'll notice is that actually your brain entirely convinces you that there is a flame there and that you are blowing a flame. And what you need to do when you're doing that is basically trick the brain into no longer believing that it's in a panic. Because a panic attack is where chemicals are being released that are making you feel stressed. So it's about calming you down, getting you out of your head and back into your body again. And the breathing techniques help with that. Now, hand mindfulness is a really simple trick as well. So one is that you breathe in and out, and tracing round. Now, if you try that, you'll notice that it's really tickly and it gets you back into the body, not just the brain. For some students, you actually have to really squeeze, and then relax. And releasing that built up chemical energy will really make them feel a lot better. Now, sometimes as a form tutor in particular, you have to start some challenging conversations. And the way to start a conversation is in a non-threatening way. So I have noticed that, and I wondered. You're not accusing a young person of anything. You are just kind of trying to express the fact that you have a feeling, an inkling that maybe something is not right. So be objective, comment on specific behaviours, not vague concerns. So for example, I've noticed that you've been going to lots of lunchtime clubs and I wondered if you're training for something in particular. Now, one of my roles is mental health lead. I'm also a DSP. So I might here be thinking, okay, maybe they're training really hard. Maybe there's something they're avoiding eating at lunchtime. Maybe I'm concerned about food and eating disorders. Possibly nothing to be concerned about. Maybe they are training for something in particular. Another one, I've noticed that there's lots of red marks on your arm. I wondered if you've been scratching yourself. Now, I know that sounds quite confrontational. You're saying actually what you've seen. But if a young person is displaying whatever their self-harm behaviour is to you, it generally means they want to talk about it. It's those who've got it hidden away who we would be far more concerned about in many ways. Now, one of the things that you might want to look at is the 5 ways to well-being. These are connect, be active, take notice, keep learning, and give. Now, these don't just matter to young people. These matter for staff as well. You need to think about the fact that actually when you're going into teaching, it's very, very easy to be in your classroom alone. And I am the first to admit that my first year of teaching, I found really hard. I think the first half term, every single Friday, I would go home and cry and say, please don't make me go back on Monday. And I lived with my brother and sister-in-law at the time, and my brother-in-law would usually pour me a glass of wine and say, it's okay, you can do it. And I did, and I kept going back. And actually, I love teaching. I'm so glad I stuck with it. But it was only when I discovered the Friday kind of pub group where I felt connected with other teachers that I actually started to truly enjoy my job properly, because I was connecting with other people who understood what it was like. Also, during that first year, I joined the Duke of Edinburgh scheme and was helping with that. And when I was getting active and doing things with the students, that really helped me to feel a lot better as well. We automatically keep learning as teachers because there's constantly new things to be trying out. But taking notice, looking outside of your classroom window and noticing, actually, oh look, the trees have changed. One of the things whilst being on lockdown, I've noticed far more than I think I ever would have done before is the change from winter to spring and the colours of the leaves changing, because I'm outside a lot more than I would have been in my classroom. And giving, it's not just about giving to charity, it's about giving your time, your words, just being there for other people. Now, these are a national strategy and they're great for young people, but you have to think about yourself as well, because your NQT year and probably your NQT +1 are going to be the toughest times that you will have in teaching. I promise it gets better, but it is really hard to begin with. There's no denying that. Now, one thing to think about is the idea of stress buckets. So we all have a bucket. Our buckets are all different sizes depending on what we've had to cope with in our lives. And you can talk this through with a young person, but also be aware of your own mental health and think about it yourself. So our buckets only have a certain capacity for holding stress. We have to be really careful that we don't allow that to overflow. So if you're putting in all your work, maybe you've got stresses at home, maybe you're trying to juggle family and a job and financial issues and all of these things, eventually it will build up to the point that it overflows, unless we have taps at the bottom to help release the stress. So when I'm teaching, I generally cope reasonably well, but there are occasions where something might come in and kind of throw me off kilter. So maybe I get in of a morning and I'm all ready for the day, but then the photocopier stops working and somebody else is off ill and I've got to sort their work out whilst also sorting my work out. And I can feel myself getting more stressed. Now, what I do, because it works for me, is I will often talk to somebody else, and I feel a lot better if I talk to somebody else. The other thing I might do is I breathe, and I'll stop and I'll just take a moment to breathe. Some people need to do exercise. Some people need to have a glass of wine. At the moment, I know I'm having to deal with the stress of having children at home whilst working. Every now and then I'm having a little bit more cake than I probably should have done, but I'm doing more exercise as well, and it's keeping me in that kind of balance so it doesn't overflow too often. But think about what is it that's causing stresses. Now, if you think a pupil has self-harmed, this is a bit of a whistle-stop tour through all sorts of different things. It doesn't matter about any of the emotional stuff to begin with. If you think somebody has self-harmed, you have to get first aid, even if it looks like it's superficial. You don't really know what they will have used to either cut themselves, or if they've taken a self-harming overdose, how many tablets they've taken and the damage that could do. So first aid is essential. After that, we then separate the injury to dealing with the underlying causes and talking through actually what could we do differently so that we're not self-harming. You should always pass it on to the pastoral lead and a DSP, because this could be part of a bigger jigsaw piece for this young person as well. So, whole load of different things going on there. Mental health is a barrier to learning, because if you haven't got your mental health in the right place, how can you learn anything else? If your brain is focused on how you're feeling and your emotions and your anxiety, you're not going to care that I'm trying to teach you about RE. You're not going to care that I'm trying to teach you a new maths equation. Actually, your brain is focused on the fact that you're feeling rubbish at the moment. So what we have to all be aware of, whatever our subject, whatever the age group we're teaching, is how are they doing emotionally, particularly after this lockdown situation, because actually we're going to have a lot of young people who are potentially quite vulnerable and have to get used to being back together again. We also have to be very aware of our own mental health, because teaching is one of the best jobs in the world. I absolutely genuinely love it. I'm now 15 years in and I wouldn't do anything else. But it is also an incredibly stressful, sometimes quite lonely, sometimes late night working, family kind of overtaking job. And we have to protect our own mental health as well, because far too many teachers leave within the first 3 years of qualifying. And that's the hardest time. If you can get through that bit and look after your mental health, you will love this job. It's been great kind of teaching you remotely here, but if you do have any specific questions and you want to talk to me specifically, I will pop my email onto the slides that you get, and you should therefore be able to drop me a line, and I'm very happy to help you in any way I can. I wish you the absolute best of luck with your course and your jobs from September, and do make sure you look after your own mental health. So I've been Laura Cole. Nice to see you. Bye-bye.